S3 as a container alternative and Node-RED. What are you going to start with tonight?
I'm going to start with S3.
All right, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to my presentation. I want to look at storing documents in FileMaker apps and how we can use S3 and similar services to gain a number of benefits over container fields. Oops. But first, we need to talk a little bit about container fields. They've been around since FileMaker was FileMaker. They're exceptionally easy to implement and they're easy to use. But when used to store large files or large numbers of files, they impose a heavy burden on your FileMaker infrastructure. It can be like a ball and chain attached to your FileMaker database, making it more cumbersome to move data between systems or to manage backups. And the more files you add, the worse it gets. S3, Simple Storage Service, it's an AWS product, and there are also a number of other providers that offer S3 compatible services. And so what is S3? S3 is an example of an object storage service. This is very different from block storage, where a certain amount of space is provisioned in advance and the device is mounted to a computer system as a volume. In object storage, objects or files are organized into buckets and stored and retrieved using API calls. And you don't have to think about the underlying hardware. You can scale from megabytes to petabytes as quickly as you can upload the data. And in S3, you only pay for what you use. In object storage, objects have paths that can look like directory structures, but they're not real directory structures. The path is really just an extended object name or key. When you upload an object to S3, it will be automatically replicated across at least 3 availability zones by the time the transaction completes. And availability zones are physically separate data centers that are at least 1.6 kilometers apart and no more than 100 kilometers apart. Amazon guarantees 11 nines durability for S3. That's 99.99 and 7 more nines% durability per year. That means if you stored 10 million objects in S3, you should expect to lose 1 file every 10,000 years on average. Caution, this doesn't protect you from accidental deletion. When you delete a file, it's deleted from all of the availability zones by the time the transaction completes, and there's no recovery. That is, unless you use a feature called versioning. There are many optional S3 features, and we won't get into them all, but here's a few that can help keep your data safe. When you turn on object versioning, anytime you attempt to overwrite or delete a file, the previous version is retained as a version. You would have to explicitly delete the version using credentials that have permission to do that in order to actually delete a file. Object lock is another feature that allows you to set a retention policy for files, preventing them from being deleted for a specific period of time or indefinitely. And block public access is a simple checkbox that is selected by default and makes it impossible to make an object available publicly. So what does S3 cost? S3 standard is the default object class in S3, and it has the highest storage cost. It's 2.3 cents US per gigabyte per month in USD, or 2.5 cents in Canada. There are other fees associated with S3, such as fees for uploads and retrievals, and fees for bandwidth you consume when you download from S3. Depending on your usage patterns, you may be able to save on fees by using different storage classes. For example, standard infrequent access cuts your storage costs by about half, but it doubles your retrieval costs. So it's recommended for objects that are accessed less frequently. One zone lowers your costs by storing your data in only one zone. So you should only use it if you have the ability to reconstruct your data if it's lost. And all the way down to S3 Glacier Deep Archive. This is for data that you access maybe once or twice a year. And you will have to wait up to 12 hours to retrieve files in Glacier Deep Archive. But it reduces your storage costs down to less than 1/10 of a cent per gigabyte per month. But most of us probably don't need to think about object classes for a while. If you're currently using containers to store data, you're probably storing no more than tens of gigabytes, maybe 100 gigabytes on the high end. That's about $3 a month with S3 standard, the most expensive class. So how do we get started? Now, all the information I'm about to show you is in the blog post, so you don't need to write anything down, and we're going to go through this relatively quickly. This is the main screen for the S3 service in AWS. To create a bucket, you'd click that orange button right there, and then you'd provide a bucket name and select a region. As you scroll down, you'll see the block all public access is selected. Leave this on. With this option enabled, you ensure that no matter what you do with individual objects, you can't accidentally make anything in your bucket public. Only an AWS identity with privileges to read the bucket will be able to access the data. After you click Create Bucket, you should see your bucket in the list. The blog post also includes some other steps like configuring your course options, that's cross-origin resource sharing, which will be necessary if you plan to interact with your bucket through a web browser or a web viewer. And it'll also walk you through the process of setting up API keys and a policy, which is similar to a privilege set in FileMaker. A pre-signed URL is a URL that can be used to make a specific call to the AWS API. It includes a signature that's generated from a set of AWS API credentials, and it allows the holder of the URL to execute that specific call for a specific period of time without granting any other access. So this is an example of a pre-signed URL. So let's have a look at what's here. This is the bucket name, which forms part of the complete host name. This is the object key, which includes the file name and optionally some additional structure to organize the file in the bucket. In this case, you can see I've used a UUID. This is the date when the pre-signed URL becomes valid, which is usually when it was created. And this is the number of seconds that it's valid for. In this case, 1 hour, but it could be anywhere from 1 second to 7 days. And lastly, this is the signature. It incorporates everything you see plus the method, such as get, put, head, or delete. If you change any detail or use a different method, the signature will no longer be valid and the request will fail. This is the FileMaker custom function that I created to produce pre-signed URLs in FileMaker. This function is available on GitHub and the link is in the blog post. There are 8 parameters. In method, you would use get, put, head, or delete, depending on the operation. In bucket, the bucket name. Region, the AWS region name, for example, CA-central-1 for Canada. In the file path, you put the object key, and then in expire seconds, provide the number of seconds you want the URL to be valid for, starting from the moment of creation. And then supply the API credentials in the next 2 parameters. And in the last parameter, the options object can be left blank in most cases, but if you use an S3 compatible service other than AWS, you can use this to pass the host name. So now let's look at a few examples of how you would use this function. So this is an upload example from a container. In line 2, we set the object key or the path, and then in line 3, we create the pre-signed URL with the put method. In line 4, we assign the container to a variable. In line 5, we set the content type or the MIME type. This is important if you ever wish to render the file from S3 in a browser, including a web viewer, as it will be sent back as a header that the browser requires to display it. Without this information, the browser will simply download the file rather than display it. And there's custom functions that you can get for FileMaker to determine the MIME type from the extension. Oh, and then in line 6, the curl string, where we prepare the header and reference the container variable. And then we make the call in line 7. And if the file upload completes, S3 sends back a 200 response code. So here's an example where we download the file to a container. In this example, we use a get method, and we don't need to supply the content type. We're expecting a binary file, and we're targeting a variable, so we have to use the fm return container variable curl option. And if the response code is 200, we should have the file in the variable, so we can set it to the container. And here's a delete example. In this case, we just use the delete method. We're expecting a 204 response code, which means that the file was successfully deleted or it never existed to begin with. And lastly, here's an example of how you would display a file in a web viewer. This example assumes that the file is an image file. If you store different types of files, you might want to build some logic to select an HTML template for different file types. For a PDF, you don't need any HTML, just pass the URL alone. An image could do that too, but it wouldn't resize to fit the layout. You can reference this calculation directly in a web viewer, but you'll find that it refreshes continuously and annoyingly while you resize the window or when you give focus to the web viewer. So I recommend to always leave the web viewer calculation empty and instead use a script trigger to set the web viewer when the layout loads or when the web viewer becomes visible, such as when changing tabs or opening a popover. Using this method, the web viewer will not continuously refresh as it's been set to a simple string rather than a calculation. Now, the web viewer allows us to view the file, and it even allows us to download the file, but you may have noticed that I promised a container alternative, and yet we're still uploading files from containers. So now I want to show you how we can use open source JavaScript tooling to take it to the next level, completely remove the containers, and build an amazing user experience that's at least as good as anything that you can do now. And if you want to bookmark the blog post, I'll give you just 10 more seconds to scan this code. I'm about to show you a demo file, and you can get your own copy from there.
I just put the URL for your blog post in the chat.
Amazing. Oops. Okay, so here's the blog post. So this walks through the process of setting up your bucket in detail, and it also includes all of the examples that we just saw. And somewhere down at the bottom, maybe there's a link.
We're looking at the wrong screen.
Oh, sorry, which screen are you seeing?
We've got this purple, beautiful screen, but it's empty.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Better?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So here's the blog post. Lots of detail here about a lot of the things that we've already talked about. And here's the sample file that you can get from there. So I've set up this example as it's a very simplified example, of course, like a project management system. So a record represents a project. This one's called My First Project. And then there's a portal that displays your attached files. So I can just click any file and it will load the image right next to it here in the web viewer. And I can resize this window and it will resize the image to fit. I can delete an image very easily. And I can click this icon here in order to get a pre-signed URL, a get URL. So if you wanted to send a file to somebody and you want to give them, say, 7 days to download it, you just click that button and they can open that URL in any web browser.
Cool.
So let's show now how we would upload files. Actually, I'm going to create a new record first, and we'll call this SOFA project. And get some images ready. So I click upload files, and I'm using a JavaScript library called Uppy. So I'm just going to grab, I think, seven files here and drag them on. And then I click upload files, 9 files. And so Uppy has uploaded all of those files to S3, and records have been created in FileMaker that reference them. So I can now view all of those files that I've just uploaded. Not only am I not storing these files on the FileMaker server, but all of that uploading, that went directly from the web viewer to S3. It didn't involve the FileMaker server at all, nor does browsing them, except to retrieve the object key from the FileMaker database. So basically what happens when I click upload files, and let's do a PDF this time. When I click upload file, JavaScript is going to call a FileMaker script, and it's going to pass into FileMaker some information about what it's doing here. File names, file size, and I think the MIME type too, actually. And then FileMaker is going to loop through those and create records, and then it's going to return the object keys back to Uppy. And then Uppy is going to use that pre-signed URL. Sorry, did I say object keys? It's going to send pre-signed URLs to Uppy, and then Uppy is going to use the pre-signed URLs to upload the files directly to S3. This works in FileMaker Pro, FileMaker Go. It also works in WebDirect, and you can also use it on any website that you create that you drive from FileMaker. Maybe I'll do a quick example of that. So this is a client portal that I've created with Charles's product, FM Better Forms. And so my clients can use this in order to open tickets and attach files, or just send files without opening a ticket. So you can see exactly the same interface that we had over here, although we also have the ability to record the screen or use the camera in this case. And then I'll get a notification when my client uploads the file. So that can be really useful if I need to get maybe database files from a new client or something like that, especially large files. So that's one example that I built into the demo file about how you might design this. Here's another one. So in this case, we're using a popover to display the file instead. And you might notice that this isn't usually possible. This is a web viewer, and web viewers don't really work in portals. Even in a popover, they take on the value from the first row. But because what I'm doing is when there's a script trigger that runs when I open this popover, and that knows the current record. So it sets the web viewer to the pre-signed URL for that row. Kind of a cool way around that limitation. And then the last one is just an example of how you might do a single attachment. So here's a new project, blah, and we're going to put a melting stream. And then, there we go. And then, so now we've just got our one image, and I cannot upload another image. I would have to delete this one first. So I can show you the S3 console a little bit here. So this is actually, I'll show you the configuration. So back here to the main page, step-by-step configuration. So there's basically 4 things that have to be set in the file here: the region, the bucket name, the access key, and the secret key. And so in this case, the bucket is called DDB demo test bucket. And here is the representation of that bucket in the S3 console. I'll just refresh. I've uploaded some objects, so now it's going to have a few more. So there's 21 objects in the bucket. And you can see that this is not a very user-friendly way to navigate them because they're just a bunch of UUIDs. I could have done that differently. I considered maybe using some sort of structure that referenced, for example, a project number. Like you might start with a module like project or invoice or whatever, and then a simpler number. But I just thought it was unnecessary complexity, and this allows me pretty much unlimited flexibility about how I can build this in FileMaker. The thing that you want to watch for, though, is you must never allow a record to be deleted in FileMaker, because you'll basically orphan this object in S3. You'll never, unless you write some sort of script to list your entire bucket and find orphaned objects, which you could totally do, you may just end up with that object in your bucket forever. Could cost you at least 2 cents a year. Is there anything going on in the chat that I need to know about?
I just
Right.
asked, yeah, I did ask a quick question. When you were demonstrating your JavaScript uploader in a FileMaker web viewer, is there a file size limit? Because in the older versions of FileMaker before 19.4, I think, or 19.3, on Windows, because they were still using the old Internet Explorer, I guess, background. So I'm just wondering if you've had any experience, like if you had to upload a 20 megabyte file or a 100 megabyte file or something.
Yeah, I'm not actually 100% sure if I've tested it with an enormous file. I certainly have with Uppy on the website, but not in a web viewer.
And Mac didn't have those limits. It was more a Windows thing.
Okay. I'll have to try it. Or somebody try it and let me know.
I think that old
Um,
limitation had to do with the URL query string length.
Oh yeah, that's much more familiar to me. Yeah, there was a limit to the length of the URL, which was a problem if you were trying to use a data URL in Explorer, right?
Okay, thanks. I didn't know. I remember there was some sort of a limit that IE was screwing around with FileMaker in the background, but supposedly in 19.3, I think that's solved with them switching to Edge as an engine.
Yeah, that solved a lot. But yeah, I think this particular problem, I think the file size wouldn't matter. I think it should be okay. I saw a great question here from Tony about thumbnails. How would you handle thumbnails? Would you use FileMaker to create thumbnails, or would you create the thumbnails using AWS technology? So I haven't done this yet. I would probably lean towards using AWS to do it because it can do it, and then I don't end up backtracking and using containers again and sending all that data back and forth to the FileMaker server. So the way you would approach this in S3, I'm sure, sorry, in AWS, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of different ways, but one way would be with a Lambda function that retrieves the file from the bucket and creates the thumbnail and then saves the thumbnail back to the bucket. So in this structure, this is sort of ideal for this because it's one quote unquote folder per file. Let's use a better example. So here's an image file. So you might say every time a image is uploaded to this bucket, call this Lambda function to resize, and then Lambda saves the resized image back to the bucket in the same folder, and maybe it appends something like underscore thumb, or maybe the dimensions or something like that. So yeah, like I said, I haven't done that, but there are lots of guides and examples for how to do that. I believe
if I might interrupt for just a second, I just wanted to say that I've actually been doing that for about a year now, and it works like magic. So I can attest that the Lambda function is absolutely the way to go to do this, from my experience.
Amazing. And who was speaking? I just want to know who you are.
I think that was Kevin.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
My name's Kevin. I'm in Florida right now.
Okay, hi Kevin.
It's not
Yeah, awesome. So if we need help with that, we can call Kevin. And that's basically yeah. So I guess there's two approaches for how you initiate it. Either you, I believe you can set up the bucket so that anytime an object is uploaded, it runs that function somewhere. The other, yeah, it might be event notifications or something like that. The other way would be when you're referencing the thumbnail, you would actually reference the Lambda function, I think. When the Lambda function runs, it would check to see if the file exists in the bucket, and then it would return it. If it doesn't exist, it would generate it and return it.
Just a quick note, if you want to build something really, really robust, what you can do is just the same thing as what Jason said, but instead put a CDN in front of it, something like CloudFront, that will cache your assets. And then in the query parameter, you can put some dimensions. like width and height of your request. And this way you don't increment to your Lambda storage at all. And instead you pass that storage into CloudFront. All right, so basically the Lambda function grabs the query parameters, resamples the image, and then returns that image, and then it's automatically cached in front of that.
Cool. Does all this apply to an alternative S3 compatible service like Wasabi? Yes, although I'm not sure if Wasabi has object classes. I think it's just sort of a one size fits all, which is also something to watch for, right? Because when they compare prices, of course, they're comparing S3 standard, which is the most expensive class. The other thing to watch for with these services, I think Wasabi is priced such that there's a minimum. So unless you're storing at least like half a terabyte or something like that, it doesn't save you anything, roughly. I downloaded files from S3 to get temporary path and browse in the calc field by global variable paths because I want to minimize costs of the file transfer. Okay. Yeah, so basically you're talking about avoiding the situation where you're retrieving the same file over and over again. Like that, basically, I think. And then, yeah, the EXIF details are part of the file, so those will be retained. So do we have any other
I've got a
questions about-
question.
Yeah.
I noticed that the files that you're using for your demo are nice little bite size, below a megabyte, I think, files. What if you're using larger files? What if you're storing larger files that are being used for printing, and they're maybe in the hundreds of megabytes, you know, 300, 400, 500 megabytes. I've got a client that builds sort of, how to describe it, sort of like custom, sort of mini custom magazines for individual clients. And they will maybe have 10 or 15 images that are each about, I don't know, a few hundred megabytes each image. And that's because they need that quality to print. How would something like this work? I would assume that you would definitely want to be storing thumbnails. And
yeah, so you'd probably do a different UI, right? Because you probably don't want to click that and have it load in a web viewer, a massive file. It can certainly handle that size files, absolutely no problem. The upload Uppy should probably work great. But yeah, this solution where as soon as you click the file, it loads it in the web viewer, you might want to, what I could do is set it up. The file size, as you can see, is stored in the FileMaker database. So you could write a condition here that instead of previewing the image, it displays a download link. Thumbnails aside, we've sort of already talked about thumbnails, and you could build that. But let me see if I have oh, here we go. Here's a zip file. So this is set up so when I click it, it doesn't try to render the file. It renders this HTML output that gives me a download button. And when I click that, it'll go to the downloads folder. So I could very easily do exactly the same thing if the file size exceeds some threshold that I've decided I don't want to preview.
I would say, if I might add again, I think everything, I like violently agree with everything Jason has said thus far. And I would say he's even being modest, because the upload is it's not just a matter of it can handle it. We now no longer have to wait for it to commit this data to FileMaker server, which just for somebody working with really large container files, it's like a really big advantage, especially if you're going to be changing records or making notes on records that aren't related data and whatnot. So there's a huge advantage for a use case that that the last person who interjected is proposing.
I've used Uppy and dropped gigabytes on it, no problem at all. Parallels.
Yeah, I was just gonna see if you want to see like here's like see how fast this is mainly because of my internet connection. So this is a 376, oh weird, 359 megabyte file. So I click upload and you can't download these from FileMaker this fast, that's for sure. There, it's done.
No way, not even close.
And then if I want to download this now, click download. Now, unfortunately, we don't get a progress feature here. This is just, it just sort of happens.
Actually, on that front, in this particular use case, things work a little bit differently. The booklet that gets created is actually generated in FileMaker. So you'd want to have those high-res images actually inserted into the booklet. But I don't think that that's really a problem at all. You just display them in the way that you were displaying those other images, but only for the purposes of creating that output file.
Let me jump in and put an idea out there that there may be use cases for a hybrid approach. First off, I read the blog post. It was a really awesome blog post. Read it twice. Really nice work. Very comprehensive. And I think all of the AWS technology that you're demonstrating, Jason, is really spot on and incredibly useful. I'm going to stand up a little bit for kind of some of the FileMaker tech and try and make a case. We'll see how it goes for a bit of a hybrid approach. I think locally stored thumbnails that are stored in container fields could fit well for some of the use cases if they're small enough. And, just for perhaps screen, not printing, 72 PPI or DPI, I forget which, might give you a nice hybrid approach, might save you some bandwidth, might give you the ability to do portals with images showing in them without the clever workaround you did. And maybe some printouts with multiple columns for product catalogs. And then when you need, higher quality, for print output, which needs higher res than screen, some sort of hybrid approach where containers are in the mix somewhere. What do you think?
Yeah. I originally was planning to do that, storing thumbnails internally, but I haven't built it, and now I don't really see myself doing it, but I agree that there absolutely could be use cases where it makes sense, especially if using a Lambda functions is sort of outside, is something you don't want to tackle.
Or if the internet goes down, if you're demonstrating to someone a
if the
product
internet
catalog
goes
in the
down, I
basement.
can't do anything.
I know. Because we have seen those systems over the year where, it's kind of a high-low thing, where like you have the massive images, which are kept in reserve for printing on shiny paper. And then, just when you got a screen sitting in front of you, 72 DPI, it gets real small.
Yeah. I just don't think that, I agree that there's definitely use cases where you need thumbnails for sure, but I would probably just do it in S3.
Yeah, well, and I think, generating the thumbnail, how you generate the thumbnail, I think is one decision. And then where I guess what you were saying in terms of the Lambda and stuff like that is you would generate the thumbnail and then potentially you'd then have a small thing. So you'd either be rendering a relatively small image through a web viewer technology, or you would be potentially downloading a image that's been reduced in the, size and or PPI, and then you'd be storing that in a local container field. And then, if the size of the images that you're using for whatever purpose are small enough, it wouldn't be too much of a burden, potentially. Anyway, I really like what you've done here.
Thanks.
Just a comment, if I may. I do believe that FileMaker actually has the create thumbnail function built in, even though I haven't used it for a long time, so that's something to look at. And obviously, if you create the thumbnail from your image when the image is stored on S3, it's so small that it's a perfect way post, I suppose, to the larger image if and when you need it. So it's a very, very fast way of getting the results that you want without even having to bother with Lambda. Not that there's any problem with Lambda. Anyway, just my 2 cents worth.
Thanks. Okay, last chance for S3 questions.
About how long would it take to start fresh, going through your blog post, step by step, putting all this together? What do you think you're in for?
Well, it depends. If you're just setting up an AWS account and a bucket in order to use this demo file, I would say you're done in 10 minutes.
What?
Even your first
Come
time,
on, you
right?
can't read the article in 10 minutes.
Well, you can really start here. Sign up for AWS. Everybody knows how to sign up for a website. Go to the S3 service, click the create button, put in a name, select a region. You can really ignore all this. It's just giving you some additional information. What's this? Find cross-origin resource sharing and paste this. And then go to your IAM service and create a policy. Paste. Make sure you change this. Let's see, what's this? Give your policy a name. It's pretty simple. We're almost done. Yeah, that's it. The steps are also in here as well. So, and there's a button here that'll copy the course configuration and the IAM policy. It already has the bucket name in it. And then you paste your keys in at the end. So yeah, I think you can do it pretty quickly. But then the question of how you integrate this with your system, that's up to you. It depends on what you want to do.
It really is quite simple, though. It really comes down to the Jason's custom function and those 2 snippets of code that he showed. It's not more complex than that. And if you think about AWS as just another table, and you're just communicating with that table, and that table is a mirror one-to-one with your whatever your documents table you have in your local file. But don't be, if you've never worked with, just a quick caveat, if you've never worked with AWS, don't be afraid of it. It's super, super simple. If you've done any kind of communication with any other API, using insert from URL, this is exactly the same. And in fact, it's easier because his function and his sample code is already producing all the stuff that you need.
Yeah, before we had the S3 pre-signed URL custom function, you would have to do quite a lot in FileMaker. Somebody did a DevCon presentation a number of years ago, and there was a script that was like pages long to calculate the signature and all of this stuff. So this just makes it so easy, just one step, to do away with all of that complexity.
Well, Jason, Ben here. Hi.
Hi.
I have to jump in at this point, just really briefly. As you know, I'm going to say, just in case anyone doesn't know, there's also a Claris Connect connector for AWS S3. And it's great, but it only does one thing. And what Jason's doing here is much more sophisticated, and I'll be using it. But just out of interest, if anyone wants to look at that. But you still have to set up your bucket. So the time, it won't save much time, but might be interesting for some people.
What is the one thing that it does?
Uploads, that's all it does. I thought you saw my presentation. I don't know, but anyway, I did a presentation on the Claris Connect thing about it, but it only does upload at the moment. If they get that connector working, it'll be interesting to do other stuff.
Yeah, and I'm sure you could, even if you're using that, there's no reason why you couldn't also use this for rendering, downloading.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So,
Is there a limit on the resolution that the web viewer can display at?
I guess your monitor.
No, for output though. So if you're going
You mean if you're printing the web viewer?
print to PDF,
Oh. Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question because I think I know why you're asking, because your client that you mentioned earlier is actually
Give us
using
that one
FileMaker to
project, yeah.
generate output.
yeah.
So yeah, there's issues with, I haven't done hardly any of this, but I know there's issues with web viewer printing. There's also JavaScript functions that can convert HTML to PDF. And some other things, maybe other people in the Zoom can share some wisdom.
Actually, a non-crazy idea would be to, in your output, actually have container fields and get everything ready. Then click the button, let it run on the server, go grab the images, put them into the container fields for generating the output, and then cleaning it up. Pull them in temporarily.
Yeah, especially if you already have that system. Yes, yeah, you could keep it. Probably if you're building something new, it probably would be better to build that report in HTML. But you can do whatever you're more comfortable doing.
Sort of, it's more, yeah, it's there are layers of complexity. But anyway, well, I'll talk to you about it sometime.
We did a project that involved printing reports with embedded PDFs. I learned a little bit along the way. Apparently, the PDF is treated like an image on the Macintosh platform, and then this was cross-platform. We went to Windows, and you know, in the version we were using, which I think was not the latest, but I don't think it's changed. The PDF on Windows was rendered to a web through WebTech, so it was an image on the Mac, and it was WebTech on PC. So we actually had to get quality output, we had to rasterize the PDF into a JPEG in order to get the fidelity quality that we were looking for. That's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, interesting.
But the project did succeed. It's just the rasterizing. We just had to kind of pivot because what did I know at the time?
What do you know now?
Less and less every day.
Tony and I are friends.
Yeah, I guess so.
All right, should we move on?
We are. That was awesome. Awesome presentation.
Really?
By the way, before you start, do you have a, that was an awesome blog post. You don't have one for the Node-RED part, do you? Getting greedy here.
I do.
You do?
Yeah, I have a blog post on how to set up Node-RED.
All right, I'm going to play along at home.